George Washington's first inauguration. Imagine a moment when a nation takes its first steps into uncharted territory, a world where the concept of a president was entirely new, and no roadmap existed to guide the way. On April 30th, 1789, George Washington stood on the balcony of New York City's Federal Hall and made history as the first president of the United States. This event was the birth of a presidency that would set the tone for centuries to come. What made Washington's inauguration so unusual? For starters, he wasn't thrilled about becoming president. Despite his legendary leadership during the Revolutionary War, Washington had hoped to retire quietly in Mount Vernon, yet his sense of duty outweighed his personal desires. When he received the unanimous vote of the Electoral College, he accepted reluctantly, borrowing the money to afford the journey to New York City. The ceremony itself was a mix of grandeur and improvisation. The Bible used for the oath of office was borrowed last minute from the nearby Masonic Lodge. Washington's speech, delivered nervously to a joint session of Congress, remains the shortest inaugural address in history at just 135 words. His voice reportedly trembled as he spoke, a humbling reminder that even the most revered figures in history were human. Andrew Jackson's chaotic celebration, 1829. Picture this. A newly elected president invites the public to celebrate his inauguration at the White House, only to see the event descend into chaos. That's exactly what happened on March 4th, 1829, when Andrew Jackson, a fiery populist and war hero, threw the most infamous inaugural celebration in American history. Jackson's presidency represented a dramatic shift in American politics. His victory signaled the rise of the common man over the traditional elite, and his supporters wanted to mark the occasion with enthusiasm. After his swearing in, thousands of Jackson's admirers flooded the White House for an open house celebration, eager to see the man they believed represented their values. What followed was nothing short of mayhem. The sheer volume of attendees, estimated at over 20,000, quickly overwhelmed the White House. Many guests were farmhands, laborers, and frontiersmen, unaccustomed to the grandeur of the presidential mansion. Tables and chairs were overturned, carpets were ruined with muddy boots, and delicate china was shattered in the crush of bodies. To make matters worse, free-flowing alcohol only fueled the rowdiness. Jackson himself was forced to flee the scene, retreating through a window to avoid being trampled. The chaos only subsided when the staff devised a clever solution. They moved large tubs of punch to the White House lawn, luring the mob outside. William Henry Harrison's lengthy speech and death, 1841. When William Henry Harrison took the oath of office on March 4, 1841, no one could have guessed that his presidency would be both historic and tragically short-lived. What began as a record-breaking inauguration would soon lead to a sobering precedent: the first president to die in office. Harrison, a seasoned military hero known as Old Tippecanoe, arrived at his inauguration, determined to dispel concerns about his advanced age, 68, making him the oldest president to date at that time. To prove his vitality, he delivered the longest inaugural address in U.S. history, an epic 8,445 words that took nearly 2 hours to read. The speech covered lofty ideals, policy visions, and an array of classical references, but its length and delivery would soon overshadow its content. The day of the ceremony was cold and blustery, with temperatures hovering just above freezing. Despite the weather, Harrison chose to forego a hat and overcoat, standing exposed to the elements as he addressed the crowd. His desire to project strength and endurance became a tragic irony. Within weeks, Harrison fell ill, reportedly developing pneumonia. His condition worsened rapidly, and on April 4, 1841, just 31 days after taking office, he died. His presidency remains the shortest in American history. Abraham Lincoln's first inauguration, 1861. On March 4, 1861, Abraham Lincoln stood on the steps of the U.S. Capitol to take the presidential oath. By the time Lincoln was sworn in, 7 Southern states had already seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. Threats against Lincoln's life were so credible that he had to arrive in Washington, D.C. under the cover of darkness, traveling secretly by train through Baltimore. Security was unprecedented, with sharpshooters stationed on rooftops and soldiers lining the streets. The ceremony itself was a dramatic juxtaposition of peace and division. Outgoing President James Buchanan sat grimly beside Lincoln, a visual representation of the failing administration handing off an explosive crisis. The Capitol dome was unfinished, a haunting symbol of a fractured nation. Lincoln's inaugural address emphasized the illegality of secession, while pledging not to interfere with slavery where it existed. His plea, "We are not enemies but friends," and his invocation of the better angels of our nature were powerful appeals to unity. Yet his words were met with skepticism by many, particularly in the South. Despite his efforts, the nation's divisions only deepened. Barely a month later, the Civil War began with the attack on Fort Sumter. The double inauguration of Rutherford B. Hayes, 1877. Rutherford B. Hayes's inauguration on March 5, 1877, was a quiet affair compared to the controversy that preceded it. Known as the Compromise of 1877, the agreement that secured Hayes's presidency ended months of political turmoil following one of the most disputed elections in U.S. history. Yet what truly made this inauguration bizarre was the need for two oaths of office, one public and one held in secret. The 1876 election had been a razor-thin contest between Hayes, a Republican, and Democrat Samuel Tilden. Tilden won the popular vote, but 20 electoral votes in several southern states were contested due to allegations of voter intimidation and fraud. A special electoral commission awarded the votes and the presidency to Hayes, but only after Republicans promised to withdraw federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. Amid fears that Tilden supporters might disrupt the inauguration, Hayes quietly took the oath of office in a private ceremony at the White House on March 3rd, 2 days before the official public event. This preemptive swearing-in marked the first time a president-elect took office in secret. Calvin Coolidge's oath by a notary, 1923. Calvin Coolidge's inauguration on August 3, 1923, was unlike any other in American history. In the early hours of that day, he took the presidential oath in the most humble of settings, a Vermont farmhouse, by the light of a kerosene lamp, and administered by none other than his own father. The unusual circumstances arose from the sudden death of President Warren G. Harding, who had been on a cross-country tour when he succumbed to a heart attack. Coolidge, then vice president, was vacationing at his family home in rural Vermont, far from Washington, D.C., and even farther from modern communication infrastructure. When news of Harding's death reached Coolidge via messenger, he responded with charismatic calm. His father, John Calvin Coolidge Sr., a notary public and justice of the peace, administered the oath of office in the parlor of their modest home. With no electricity in the house, the scene was illuminated by a flickering kerosene lamp, lending an almost surreal atmosphere to the historic moment. The simple ceremony stood in stark contrast to the grandeur of traditional inaugurations. Coolidge reportedly said little afterward and went straight to bed, resuming the presidency with the same no-nonsense demeanor that would define his administration. Though Coolidge later retook the oath in Washington to quell concerns about its validity, the Vermont ceremony remains one of the most unique and personal inaugurations in American history. It epitomized the quiet, unpretentious character of the man who had become known as Silent Cal. Franklin D. Roosevelt's fourth inauguration, 1945. Franklin D. Roosevelt's fourth inauguration on January 20, 1945, marked an unprecedented event. No president before or since has served 4 terms, and reflected the extraordinary challenges of leading the nation through the Great Depression and World War II. Yet it was also the most subdued inauguration of Roosevelt's presidency, shaped by the burdens of war and the president's declining health. Unlike the elaborate ceremonies of his previous inaugurations, this one was held on the south portico of the White House, rather than the Capitol steps. The reason was practical. The country was at war, and resources were being conserved for the war effort. Additionally, Roosevelt's health had visibly deteriorated, and a shorter, simpler ceremony was deemed appropriate. Gone were the grand parades and extravagant receptions. In their place was a brief and intimate affair. Roosevelt's inaugural address, his shortest at just over 5 minutes, called for the nation to remain steadfast as victory approached. His frail appearance underscored the weight of his words, and his voice, though steady, lacked the energy of a powerful leader. Lyndon B. Johnson's airplane swearing-in, 1963. It was an event born of tragedy, necessity, and history. On November 22, 1963, Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in as President of the United States aboard Air Force One, just hours after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. This unprecedented moment marked the first, and so far only, time a president took the oath of office aboard an airplane. The scene was surreal. Air Force One sat on the tarmac at Love Field in Dallas, Texas, preparing to return to Washington, D.C., with the body of President Kennedy in its cargo hold. As the weight of the nation's shock and grief hung in the air, Johnson, the vice president, stood ready to assume the highest office. To ensure continuity of government during a time of national crisis, the swearing-in ceremony was hastily arranged. The oath was administered by Judge Sarah T. Hughes, a federal district judge from Texas, making her the first woman to swear in a U.S. president. The photograph of the moment has become iconic. Johnson, somber yet composed, with a visibly shaken Jackie Kennedy standing beside him, still wearing the blood-stained pink suit she had on during the assassination. Jimmy Carter's walk to the White House, 1977. Inaugurations are often grand displays of pomp and tradition, but Jimmy Carter's in 1977 stood out for its simplicity and a groundbreaking gesture. After taking the oath of office, Carter and his wife Rosalind walked hand in hand down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House, foregoing the usual motorcade. This unassuming act transformed the tone of presidential inaugurations and left an indelible mark on American history. Carter's inauguration came at a time when the country craved connection and authenticity. The Watergate scandal and Vietnam War had eroded public trust in government, and Carter, a peanut farmer and former Georgia governor, had campaigned as a man of the people, offering honesty and humility. His decision to walk symbolized a desire to bridge the gap between the presidency and ordinary citizens. The walk was both practical and deeply symbolic. By stepping out of the armored limousine and onto the streets, Carter demonstrated accessibility and an enduring sense of humility. Crowds lining the avenue were thrilled, waving and cheering as the new president and first lady casually greeted them. Barack Obama's flubbed oath, 2009. Barack Obama's historic inauguration on January 20, 2009, was a moment of unprecedented significance. He was the first African-American president, sworn in before an ecstatic crowd of nearly 2 million people in Washington, D.C. Yet amid the soaring rhetoric and jubilant celebrations, the ceremony included an unusual hiccup. The oath of office itself was botched. The mishap occurred as Chief Justice John Roberts administered the 35-word oath prescribed by the U.S. Constitution. Roberts, delivering the lines without a written prompt, inverted the word order in one part, saying, "I will execute the office of the President of the United States faithfully," rather than "faithfully execute." Obama hesitated, then repeated the incorrect phrasing, creating a moment of awkwardness during an otherwise meticulously planned event. While the error might seem minor, it created debate over whether Obama had legally assumed the presidency. To resolve any doubt, the oath was administered again the next day in a private ceremony at the White House. This time it was reportedly delivered flawlessly. Thomas Jefferson's casual entrance, 1801. Thomas Jefferson's first inauguration on March 4, 1801, was a quiet yet groundbreaking moment in American history. It wasn't just unusual for its simplicity. It marked the first peaceful transfer of power between opposing political parties, a feat that was far from guaranteed in the young republic. Jefferson, a Democratic Republican, defeated incumbent John Adams, a Federalist, in a contentious and divisive election. The transition of power tested the durability of the Constitution, as many feared political conflict or even violence. Instead, the day became a symbol of democratic resilience and a model for the world. Unlike his predecessors, Jefferson chose to downplay the ceremony's pomp. Rejecting the aristocratic airs often associated with the presidency, he walked to his swearing-in rather than arriving by carriage, setting a tone of humility. His attire was unassuming, reflecting his vision of a government close to the people. The inauguration itself took place in the Senate chamber of the Capitol, a modest and understated venue. Jefferson's address was conciliatory. His famous words, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists," appealed to a fractured nation to see beyond party lines and work together for the common good. James Monroe's two-day inauguration, 1817. James Monroe's first inauguration on March 5, 1817, holds a unique distinction. It was the first presidential swearing-in postponed due to bad weather. Though inaugurations typically occurred on March 4th, Monroe's took place a day later, after a rare combination of circumstances disrupted the usual schedule. Monroe, a Democratic Republican and the last of the Founding Fathers to serve as president, was set to take office at a time of relative peace and prosperity following the War of 1812. His inauguration symbolized the beginning of what would be called the Era of Good Feelings. However, the celebrations were off to a rocky start when a massive snowstorm swept through Washington, D.C. on March 4th, making outdoor festivities impossible. The delay gave Monroe a unique inauguration spanning 2 days. The official swearing-in took place indoors in the Senate chamber on March 5th, as Washington began to dig out from the storm. The parade and public events were pushed back, with the usual pomp and circumstance muted by the challenging conditions. The first televised inauguration, Harry S. Truman, 1949. On January 20, 1949, Harry S. Truman's inauguration made history as the first ever to be televised. For the first time, Americans across the country could witness the peaceful transfer of power in their own living rooms. This groundbreaking event was more than a technological milestone. It was a moment that redefined the relationship between the presidency and the people. The post-war era was a time of rapid change and optimism, and Truman's second inauguration reflected this modern spirit. Over 37 million Americans tuned in to their television sets to watch Truman take the oath of office, marking the start of a new era of mass media. What had once been an event accessible only to those who could travel to Washington, D.C., now became a shared experience for the nation. The inauguration showcased technological and ceremonial advancements. The parade that followed was one of the largest and most elaborate in history, featuring floats, military units, and marching bands that were broadcast to millions. Truman's speech, delivered with his trademark straightforwardness, focused on his vision for the future, including the implementation of his ambitious Fair Deal domestic program and a commitment to global leadership during the early years of the Cold War. Ronald Reagan's warmest and coldest inaugurations, 1981 and 1985. Ronald Reagan's inaugurations were historic not only for his transformative presidency, but also for the extreme weather conditions that defined them. His first inauguration in 1981 was the warmest on record, while his second in 1985 was the coldest, two extremes that made both events uniquely memorable. On January 20, 1981, Reagan was sworn in as the 40th President of the United States on a balmy day with temperatures reaching a mild 55 degrees Fahrenheit. The pleasant weather set a celebratory tone for the occasion, and Reagan's inaugural address struck a chord with Americans seeking optimism after years of economic and political challenges. The highlight of the day was Reagan's symbolic act of taking the oath of office facing the west front of the Capitol, a departure from tradition that symbolized America's westward expansion and boundless potential. Fast forward 4 years to January 21, 1985, postponed by law since January 20th fell on a Sunday, and the mood and temperature was dramatically different. An unprecedented Arctic blast swept through Washington, D.C., with wind chills plunging to a dangerous minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit. For safety reasons, The swearing-in ceremony was moved indoors to the Capitol Rotunda, marking the first indoor inauguration since 1909. The parade and other outdoor festivities were canceled, but Reagan's second inaugural address still carried his trademark warmth and vision for a hopeful future. Bill Clinton's Saxophone Parade, 1993. On January 20, 1993, Bill Clinton's inauguration was more than a political event. It was a cultural movement that signaled a generational shift in American leadership. From Fleetwood Mac's electrifying performance of Don't Stop to the youthful energy of Clinton himself, this was no ordinary swearing-in ceremony. And at the heart of it all was a unique presidential flourish: Clinton's love for the saxophone, which made its presence felt throughout the day's celebrations. Clinton, then 46 years old, was the first baby boomer president, and his inauguration was a departure from the formal, often somber tone of previous ceremonies. The festivities reflected his campaign's optimistic mantra, "Don't stop thinking about tomorrow." The theme carried through in every detail, including the choice of Fleetwood Mac, whose 1977 hit had become his campaign anthem, to perform live. Their rousing rendition in front of an energized crowd set the tone for an event that felt more like a cultural festival than a traditional political milestone. The saxophone, an instrument Clinton famously played during his campaign appearances and on late-night television, became a subtle but powerful symbol of his connection to the people. While he didn't perform at the inauguration, his affinity for music and pop culture was celebrated throughout the day. This departure from political stiffness made Clinton seem more approachable and relatable, particularly to younger Americans. Thank you very much for watching this video and making it to the end. If you learned something, make sure to leave a like. Comment down below what types of videos you want to see from this channel in the future. Anyways, thanks again, and goodbye.